we have is a technology with a very old history. It was actually invented originally by IBM, I think. I can't remember 100%, but I think it was IBM that was charged with by the American military to find a way where information could be sent down the command chain and be proven not to be tampered with. So information couldn't change giving military commands down the chain. And they've devised this way of chaining information together in a blockchain, which is called today, so you can't fake it. Now let's have a look at that later on. So some of our friends have come up with various metaphors around the blockchain, and John Yeomans, who is CEO of Transact24, calls it the irrefutable chain of truth. I call it automating trust. I mean, after the first time when I came home to my wife and said, listen, I found this new thing called blockchain. And she said, what's that? And I told her, I talked for 1.5 hours, and in the end she said, shouldn't we watch a movie instead? So after being pushed into the corner multiple times, I ended up with these two words, automating trust. Just a little bit about what happened here. I mean, the technology was not fast enough to use blockchain technology, encryption, etc. back then in '54 or whatever it was. So it was basically shelved, this idea, and then Satoshi Nakamoto may have found it. We don't know who he is. He could be military US for all we know, but somebody at least found this methodology of chaining information together and started making Bitcoin as a provocation and an attack on the central banks during the crisis 2008-9. So of course he was not liked, and Bitcoin was to some extent viewed as a terrorism. But during time, actually, banks and other people around the globe saw other opportunities with this technology, and this is what we see now happen. Banks are reacting now. We're seeing enormous growth in this area, particularly in Zug, where I come from, of Crypto Valley, during the last 1.5 years. Massive amounts of money have been invested just the last half year. Something like between $500 million and $1.5 billion, all about, depending on how you evaluate the cryptocurrencies, have been invested just in this little community alone. So people are also diverting away from the vision into ambition, and it becomes all about money, which is a shame, actually. This is a blockchain. The documents with the hashes are chained together using these numbers. I will go quickly through here. So what is happening is a stack of information, basically like in a database, where you have the first one down here, it grows upwards, and you put another one on top like that, and the data can be anything. In Bitcoin, I'll get back to what it is in Bitcoin, but you can put whatever you want in there. So this is how it works. If one of these hashes differ from what it should be, we know that somebody has changed data, and we can dismiss it. We just say it's invalid. So how it's working, so we have a genesis block, the first data element. It's basically the data plus a seed, usually 0. You add these two together in a binary format, run the hash function, and then you put that in. The next one is the same. You just take the previous hash and put that in instead of the seed, and you continue that way. And that way these things get changed together. You can only add to this. Because of this functionality, you cannot change and you cannot remove. I usually use the metaphor, it's like a stack of papers. When you put another paper on top of the stack, you cannot change it, you cannot remove it. And then people ask me, that's stupid. If I have a Word document and I add it to the stack and then later find out that I made a spelling mistake, just a small spelling mistake, why should I not be able to correct it? And that's true, you can't. But you can add another one with the spelling mistake corrected, that is version 2, and relate it to the previous one, and then you have a new version of it. And that actually gives you an advantage because you have an audit trail of what happened with a document. So this is a basic blockchain.
I just want to know the pros and cons of using that. You know, Ethereum's thing is different.
Yes?
Yeah, I just want to know why they are different and why that
Why Bitcoin and Ethereum is different?
why the spending, how they spend the transactions.
I have not been diving into the details of how transactions are constructed, the business logic in Ethereum, but I imagine it's pretty much the same. I know Vitaly, he was using Bitcoin, the open source software, when he modeled his Ethereum, so most likely most of it's exactly the same, but his idea was to build this virtual machine on top, this what is called solidity programming, so a scripting language that can be run inside the thing. So there's a sort of computer or interpreter inside this new blockchain that he made. That's the main difference. So it's a good question, because what you're addressing is what I call version 1 and version 2 of Bitcoin, or blockchain technology. So I'm not using the wrong word to say. Yeah, because Bitcoin was the first generation. The second generation, the first time we actually had a real paradigm shift where technology really took a step forward, was with the virtual machines in smart contracts. Suddenly you can run a contract on on the blockchain and be sure it's executed exactly that way across the globe. So it runs on every computer across the globe, basically. That's second step. We do not have a third step yet. We may have 2.1, 2.2, maybe even 2.5, but there's no third step. And just as an analogy, when I started my first company, I was 17 years old. I started an internet service provider in Denmark. I saw this internet thing. I thought, wow, this can make everybody communicate across the globe freely. Everybody can get access to education, information, science, or whatever. So I told my parents I wanted to start an internet service provider, and they said, son, if you do that, you're in jail in 2 years because it's all pornography. And it was all pornography back then. The same is the case with Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies today. The first example of uses was, what was it called? Silk Road, yeah, exactly. And that was just selling drugs. So you will always see the crooks coming onto new technology that is unregulated. This is normal. But it is also, sometimes at least, a validation that there is something here to go for.
And especially crypto trading, right?
Yeah.
What's your take on like the volatility of the market?
Yeah, well, if you ask me how much Bitcoin I own, it's 0. I don't gamble. I invest my time in good ideas. Looking in the mirror, however, I would have been quite wealthy. I could buy them for $10 when I could. But the volatility of the market, well, it's a small market. There's not that many users. It's growing. I mean, back 3 years ago, we were laughing about if somebody bought a car or a house using Bitcoin, you would see a large fluctuation in the currency exchange rate because it was a really big transfer, a really big amount impactful. It's not the case anymore. It's flattening out. So mass adoption will of course stabilize the currencies. You can imagine, at least there's never any guarantee. It's the same with any other scarcity-based asset class out there. It's basically what people believe it's worth. It's up to individuals to decide. And right now everybody thinks that they can get rich on Bitcoin. The reality is a slightly different one. I think if you look at the exchange rates and how it's going, you will see that the whales, they call them the whales, those guys typically from China with large amount of money. They sit on massive capital. So they start selling from different accounts little by little with random intervals, so that it looks like normal people are selling. So you get the curve and it starts going down, and then everybody says, oh, it's going down, it's a good time to sell before it goes too low. So everybody sells. So they just initiate that everybody else sells, and a large amount of people sell. When it goes down at the bottom, they start buying. So they're milking the market by riding these waves. And if you know how to see this, you can ride them too and make money. But if you don't, you lose.
Now, with what I've seen, what the the blockchain technology can do, whether it's government or health or national identification and things like that. Do you think, because Ugandans generally, we're just getting into digital literacy, it's not something that we've had a lot of focus on, ICT in schools. Do you think that having blockchain information passed on is really vital, especially when I think of things like population records and stuff like that, because we're projected to be about 80 million in about 20 years.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's productive.
Yeah, we have a 3% growth rate. So how can this technology be used by maybe our government, or is it something that we should really look into using?
Absolutely. I have no doubt that this will be a game changer for any government that adopts this will make itself more efficient and trustworthy to its population. And I like one part of the question is what skills are actually needed. This is
So
one
I
of
know
the,
you've mentioned a lot, ICT obviously, the computer programming or computer science is a backbone which also everyone needs today.
you need to have some technical knowledge, of course. It's all technical knowledge. Programming is part of it. I mean, when I talk about smart contracts to the regulator back in Switzerland, and ask them, they think, at least before I talked to them, they thought that this was like a written contract with signatures and small print and all that, which it isn't. It's a program, if then else. Example, you and I make a bet.
Yeah.
If it rains in Tokyo and the sun shines in New York and Kenya lost in football to Uganda within the last 2 weeks, you get my thousands. If that does not happen in 2 months, I get your 1,000. So we make a smart contract, program that into a contract. We give the money to the contract, it owns the money. They're gone. And this contract will then check these things, and if suddenly you win, you get the money, and if the 2 months ends, I get the money. So we have a contract that is a program. So suddenly people who write contracts need to be programmers. There we have one of the key issues. We need tech people and legal people in one person. Now I just explained to this gentleman before that we also talk about an incentivized economy you can build into a smart contract when you make it more than advanced than a pen. And then we need economists. So you need in one person some tech, some legal, and a good deal of economy.
So the backbone really is technology.
It's technology, economy, and legal.
Now I'm imagining, people imagine the computers, connect them to the internet and then begin to issue currency in the name of Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrency. So I want to learn from experiences whether they have similar kind of approach that the central bank has the reserve, issue currency, but now there are individuals within the economy who are also issuing the currency. Have they been arrested? Because it is an offense.
Is one of the means government has to influence its economic position towards other countries in terms of competition. They can devaluate to give their home country an advantage. It can also be used in a corrupt way. It can be used in many different ways. I was working with the biggest Scandinavian bank called Nordea. They had a dream about making a scan coin. They would like to make a currency for the entire Scandinavian countries, all 4 of them, and balance that out. You can do that in a smart contract. You can say that the currency exchange rate is tethered or linked to a bucket of a basket of currencies, for example, the fiat currencies. The whole point is that, there's no avoiding it. The example I usually use is the one with Marco Polo, who lived in 1200 something. He was the son of a rich merchant in Venice, where the Pope lived back then. And they were doing trade, really big trade, with ships coming in and out. And with all this money, they decided, the father and the son, that they wanted to explore the world. So they sailed all the way to China. They spent 30 years exploring the world. The father died of natural causes during this trip, and Marco Polo came back to Venice in 1250 or something like that, and said to the people there, you know what? In China they use paper for money. You know, and he was almost put to jail because everybody knew that carrying out bucket loads of gold and silver was much better money. Particularly the Pope didn't like that paper money because he had a lot of gold. Yeah? It took 50 years and everybody used paper for one simple reason. It's more convenient. You can have it in a wallet and you can go do the trade. You can denominate to both directions. Very simple. Cryptocurrencies doesn't have to be Bitcoin or Ethereum. It could be Uganda coin for all I know. And it could still be controlled by the central bank. But the convenience of having digital money means you don't have to print these notes. They can't be counterfeited. You can't counterfeit them. Now you can, but and it's extremely expensive to police. We were talking to the police yesterday. You need to find out, I mean, these notes, these paper notes, they get worn out. The metal coins are expensive to produce. People drop them in rivers. You need to produce new ones. You need to shred old ones. It's a really expensive business to keep the money around in the country. When you can do it digitally for nothing and much more efficiently and have full transparency, depends on how you put data into your blocks.